The first thing Cassidy Holt did every morning was count. She counted the ridgelines visible from the high rock above the tree break. She counted the approaches a vehicle could use to reach her land without her hearing it first. She counted the seconds between wind gusts off the northern face, because wind mattered when you were working at distance, and distance was the only language she had ever truly trusted. This morning she counted 6 men. She had been watching them for 40 minutes, belly flat, against the same cold granite she used every time she needed to see the lower valley without being seen. The rock pulled heat from her body the way it always did. She did not mind. Cold kept you honest. Through the scope, the 6 men moved the way men move when they believe no one is watching. Loose, careless, the kind of careless that comes from a deep and unexamined certainty that the world belongs to you, and that whatever you reach for will simply be there when your hand arrives. The man in the tan jacket gave the orders. She had established that in the first 3 minutes. He moved differently from the others. Not faster, not stronger, but with a particular economy of gesture that told her he had never once in his life been made to hurry. He pointed. They moved. He pointed again. They moved again. He crushed a wildflower under his boot without looking down, without breaking stride, because it was in his path and the idea of going around it had never occurred to him. Cassidy watched him do it, and something cold settled into the center of her chest. Not anger. Anger was hot and imprecise and got people killed. This was something older and more useful. Recognition. She had seen this exact shape of man before. 3 different countries. Different clothes, different languages, different weapons. The surface changed every time. The shape never did. The ease never did. The absolute certainty that the world was simply a thing you reached out and took. She had spent the first half of her career hunting men like him. She had spent the last 6 years trying to forget they existed. Below her, 2 of the men reached the fence line at the lower edge of her property. Wire cutters came out. The second man lifted a barrel from the back of the nearest truck and carried it toward the stream, moving with the flat efficiency of someone completing a paid task. Cassidy watched the barrel. It was not a barrel of water. She had seen this before in other contexts, other places. The barrel went into the stream slowly, deliberately, the man watching the current change color downstream with the satisfaction of a job getting done. 2 deer appeared at the tree break above the stream, drawn by the sound of water. They came down to drink. They staggered within minutes. They did not get back up. The man in the tan jacket watched the deer fall and grinned. Cassidy's finger moved to the trigger guard. She did not press it. Not yet. She was still counting. The other 4 men had spread across the lower slope with their rifles up, boots moving in a pattern she recognized immediately. Not the loose wandering of poachers. Not the casual drift of trespassers. A grid, left to right, right to left, moving uphill in a slow, deliberate sweep. That was the thing that did not fit. Poachers did not grid search. Men who had wandered too far from a hunting camp did not grid search. Grid searching was a skill you were taught by someone who needed you to find something specific without missing it. These men had been taught. She came off the scope and studied the man in the tan jacket with her naked eye. He stood at the cut fence holding his phone at an angle, comparing it to the terrain above him, nodding slowly to himself, the way a man nods when a real thing matches a picture he has been carrying for a long time. He had coordinates. Someone had given him coordinates to something on this mountain. She went back to the scope. The 4 searching men had reached the old fence line near the pine grove at the eastern edge of her property. They stopped. The man in the tan jacket raised his hand and called across the slope. Distance swallowed the sound before it reached her, but his lips were readable. She had learned that over a long career because radios failed and distance was absolute, and sometimes a man's mouth was the only intelligence you could get. She read 3 words off him. Check that ridge. Her breath caught. He was pointing at the eastern ridge, at the concrete lip barely visible through the tree line, at the one feature of this mountain that had no business being there, that she had spent 8 months hoping no one with a grid pattern and a phone full of coordinates would ever point at. They knew. Not as a rumor, not as a guess. They had a survey. They had the location marked. Someone had prepared these men with specific information about a specific thing buried in a specific mountain that Cassidy Holt had bought with the last of her savings, because a real estate agent told her it had no history, that no one had ever lived here, that it was cheap because it was empty. She had believed that for 3 weeks. Then she had found the door. Cassidy closed her eyes for one long second. Behind them, she saw faces she had not let herself think about in a very long time. A medic named Garrett who hummed old country music while he stitched men back together in conditions that would have broken anyone without his particular brand of stubborn calm. A demolitions man named Wade who laughed at danger because laughter was the only thing that kept his hands steady when they needed to be steady most. A recon man named Dex who could disappear in an open field and had once walked through a perimeter she had set herself without triggering a single sensor. She had told herself she did not need any of them. She had told herself a lot of things up here. Cassidy opened her eyes. The 4 men were almost at the concrete lip. Almost at the door she had spent 8 months guarding without anyone knowing it existed, without anyone knowing she was guarding it. She fired. The first shot was clean and the man at the front dropped before the sound reached the others. The mountain caught the crack and threw it back from 4 directions at once, which was one of the reasons she had chosen this position, and the remaining men scattered immediately, screaming, firing wildly at trees and shadows and the general direction of a threat they could not locate. She was already shifting. The second man went down 2 steps from cover, and the mountain swallowed that sound and threw it somewhere else entirely. The man in the tan jacket was behind a boulder now, his easy manner completely gone, his voice carrying up the slope in ragged pieces she did not need to hear to understand. She let the other 2 run for the trucks. Dead men told no stories. Terrified men told all of them. She wanted whoever had sent these people to know exactly how badly it had failed. Fear bought time, and time was the one thing she genuinely needed. She watched the man in the tan jacket press his back against the boulder, pull out his phone with a shaking hand. His lips moved. She read the words off him from nearly a mile away with the clarity of something printed on a page. It's gone wrong. She lowered the rifle. She sat back against the cold rock, looked up at the wide, pale sky, and waited for her hands to stop shaking on their own schedule, which was the only schedule they ever kept. 2 more, she thought. 2 more added to the weight she had been carrying since before she bought this mountain. She had promised herself when she came here that she was done adding weight. The mountain had other ideas. She was breaking down the position, sliding back off the ridge with her gear, when the engine sound reached her. A single vehicle grinding up the old logging trail. She had the rifle back up by the time she reached the tree brake scope on the hood, reading the markings through the glass before the truck had finished its climb. County. A single county truck moving at the careful speed of a man who did not want to miss anything on the way up. She kept the rifle on it until it stopped at the bottom of her steps. Kept it up while the door opened. Kept it up while a man in his mid-50s climbed out the way men climb out when their knees have logged more miles than they intend to admit. He wore a sheriff's uniform and took his hat off immediately, which she noted as the first sign of a careful man. She came down off the ridge and crossed the yard and met him at the bottom of the steps with the rifle slung and her hands visible because that was the language a careful man would understand. "Sheriff Dale Murch," he said. He did not offer his hand. He read her right on that. "You know why I'm here?" "I know why you're here," she said. He looked up at the high ridge where she had been lying an hour ago. Read the distance the way a man reads it when he is trying to understand something that does not yet make sense. Then he looked at her. "I've got 2 dead men on the south slope and 2 more who came into town last night talking about ghosts. You know anything about that?" "Yes." He had clearly expected denial deflection, a lawyer's number. He got 1 flat syllable and stood with it for a moment. "You want to think before you keep talking to me?" "No." "That's nearly a mile," he said. "On the second one." "Closer to 1,400 yards, Cassidy said. "Nobody makes that shot." She looked at him the way she looked at everything, searching for the lie under the surface. She found instead the face of a man who had been a lawman in one county for long enough that surprise had worn itself down to something that merely required acknowledgement. "I do," she said. Murch stood there for a moment. Then, without being invited, he climbed her steps and sat down on the bench across the porch as though his legs had simply made the decision. "I came up here ready to arrest you," he said. 2 bodies. That's not something I can drive away from." "I know." "Then why aren't you running? Why aren't you making this hard?" Cassidy set the rifle against the wall and faced him with her hands loose at her sides. "Because they weren't poachers," she said. "They didn't come up here to run deer or pull a fence. They came for what's buried beneath my land. And the man who sent them is going to send more, and the next group won't be drunks with rifles." She looked at him steadily. "So no, I'm not running. There's nowhere far enough." The morning wind moved between them. Somewhere down the slope, a bird that had survived the poison stream called once and went silent. "What's buried beneath your land?" Murch asked. Cassidy held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked to her door and held it open. He followed without being asked, and that told her something. She led him through the back room and down the concrete stairs she had uncovered and rebuilt herself over 3 weeks, buying tools with cash from hardware stores 2 hours away, never twice from the same place. He did not speak when they reached the bottom, and he saw the steel door set into the living rock of the mountain, or the military stenciling on it that had not been touched since the men who painted it walked away believing it would never be seen again. He stopped breathing for a moment. She heard it stop and then resume. "What is this?" he said. "An installation," Cassidy said. "Cold War. Built in '61. Decommissioned in the '80s, landmarked, abandoned, eventually sold off to whoever was foolish enough to buy a mountain with no road." She put her hand flat on the cold steel. "Me. What's inside?" "Records. Sealed archives. Decades of them. Names, dates, payments, contracts, transfers." She pressed her palm harder against the metal. "An entire network of people who turned this country's defense budget into a private bank account. 3 generations of it. Contractors, intelligence officials, politicians, executives. 50 years of evidence that someone buried in a hole in the mountains of Idaho and assumed would rot." She lowered her hand. "It didn't rot." Murch leaned against the wall. "If even a piece of that's real," he said slowly. "All of it's real. I've spent 8 months in there. I know whose names are on the contracts, and I know where the money went, and I know what happened to the men who were supposed to have that equipment and didn't." She looked at him. "If you've ever attended a military funeral and shaken hands with a family and wondered why the thing that killed their son felt preventable, some of those funerals are in there, with the receipts." He put a hand slowly down his face. "Why didn't you take it somewhere? FBI, a journalist, somebody." The bitterness in her voice was old and worn smooth, the kind that comes from carrying a thing until the edges no longer cut. "Sheriff," she said, "who do you think buried it the first time? Who marked this range abandoned? Who made sure the land sold for nothing so no one would ever come looking?" She shook her head. "I tried trusting the system once with something a lot smaller than this. It cost good people their lives, and the men responsible got promoted. I will not make that mistake again. When this comes out, it comes out in a way they cannot bury. Or it doesn't come out at all." The mountain hummed around them, deep and patient, entirely indifferent to the things humans had built inside it. Murch straightened. "What do you need?" She looked at him. She had prepared arguments. She had not prepared for 2 plain words offered without condition. "I need time," she said. "I can hold this mountain. I've done it once and I'll do it again." "But the man who sent those people doesn't want the evidence recovered. He wants it erased. And he wants everyone who's seen it gone with it." She paused. "That includes you now." "I told you it would." "I know," Murch said. "I climbed up here anyway." Something in Cassidy's chest eased a fraction. "Enough to matter." "Then we better get to work," she said. She walked him back upstairs and watched his truck disappear down the logging trail with the first promise of help she had accepted from anyone in 6 years. The untraceable phone sat in her jacket pocket. She had bought it at a gas station in Eastern Oregon 14 months ago, paying cash, telling herself she would only use it for emergencies. She had been revising her definition of emergency upward for 8 months as the situation on the mountain grew past the point one rifle could manage. This was past the point. This had been past the point for weeks. She pulled the phone out and stood on the porch with it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Then she scrolled to a number she had memorized and never dialed. A medic who used to hum old country songs while he put people back together. Who had a steadiness under pressure she had never seen matched. Who had every right to hate her for 6 years of silence. She pressed the button. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, and she was already composing the voicemail in her head, already choosing which words to leave in the dark. Then a voice, rough and disbelieving. "Cassidy, is that really you?" She closed her eyes. "Garrett," she said, "I need you to come home. All of you. It's real, and it's bad, and I cannot do this one by myself." There was a silence on the line. the kind that holds years inside it. Then Garrett Bowen said the only thing she needed to hear. "Where do you need me?" She opened her eyes and looked out at the mountain. The mountain powerful men had believed was empty, abandoned history safely forgotten. The mountain that held 50 years of buried truth in its belly and one tired woman on its face who had been keeping the secret long enough. Here she thought, "I need you here. All of you." Garrett Bowen arrived 40 hours after the phone call in a truck that had seen better decades, and he did not say hello. He stepped out in the gravel yard and stood looking at her across the distance between them with his medical bag in one hand. He was bigger than she remembered, or maybe she had simply forgotten what it looked like to have someone that solid standing on her land. "You look terrible," he said. "You look old," Cassidy answered. "I am old. You did this to me. 6 years, Cassidy. 6 years of nothing, and then a phone call at midnight sounding like the war never ended." She walked down the steps and put her arms around him, and he stood stiff for exactly 1 second before one arm came around her back and held on, and the medical bag dropped into the gravel between their feet. "It didn't end," she said. "That's the thing nobody tells you. It just goes quiet for a while and waits." He pulled back and studied her face the way he had always studied faces, the medic's habit of reading past the surface to the condition beneath. "Tell me everything before the others get here. Come inside. Then tell me if you think it's stupid." 20 minutes later, Garrett was sitting on the concrete stairs above the bunker door, a folder open across his knees, his face the color of old chalk. His hands, which had been steady through 100 situations that would have broken other men, were not entirely steady now. "This is real," he said, "not a question. It's real." He turned a page, then another. He stopped at a name and pressed his finger flat against the paper and looked at it for a long time. "This man," he said. "This man shook my hand at a homecoming, stood on a stage in front of my whole unit, told me I was a hero. His jaw worked. And according to this, the same week he was shaking my hand, he was signing off on diverting the equipment that got men in my own platoon killed." He closed the folder, sat with it shut in his lap, and stared at the steel door. "How long have you been sitting on this alone?" 8 months. 8 months! He shook his head. "Why did you wait so long to call?" Cassidy looked at the door. "Because I didn't think any of you would come," she said. "After the way I left. After 6 years of nothing. I figured you all had every right to want nothing to do with me. And I figured asking for help was just one more way of putting people in front of a bullet meant for me." She paused. "I was wrong about a lot of things up here." Garrett stood and put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed once hard. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "Now show me this mountain, because if people are coming, we don't have time for feelings. We can have feelings later if we survive." They walked the perimeter together, while the light held Cassidy moving ahead through the terrain she had memorized over 8 months, Garrett following with the attentiveness of a man building a map he will need in the dark. She showed him the sensor lines, the fallback points, the medical cache positions she had pre-staged in 3 locations. He adjusted 2 of them without asking, repositioning supplies with the instinct of someone who had prepared for aftermath in worse places than this. They talked while they moved, never standing still, the whole briefing delivered in motion through pine and granite and fading Idaho light. The second truck arrived at dusk. Wade Pruitt climbed out grinning the way he had always grinned, which was to say, like a man arriving somewhere he had been looking forward to for a long time. "The ghost lives," he called across the yard. "They told me you went up a mountain to disappear, and here you are starting a war instead. That is so much more your speed." He swept her up off her feet before she could stop him, spun her once, set her down, and in the same motion was already turning to scan the ridge lines above the cabin with the reflexive assessment of someone who cannot enter a space without mapping it for exits. "Garrett said you found something that might get us all killed," he said. "I said finally a vacation." He clapped his hands together. "Where do you need me? Tell me about the approaches." They walked while she told him. Wade moved differently from Garrett through the terrain, not cataloging it but consuming it, reading every rise and depression, the way a man reads a blueprint, already calculating what could be done with each feature. When she showed him the east draw, he crouched at the entrance and was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in his head. "This is your soft approach," he said. "It looks that way," Cassidy said. He looked up at her and the grin came back, but with something different underneath it now. Something focused. You made it look that way on purpose. I've been here 8 months, she said. Wade stood and looked at the draw again and nodded slowly. How long do I have? 3 days, maybe less. He rolled his neck once and headed back toward his truck for his gear. 3 days, he said. That's 3 days too many to give me something like this. I'll be thorough. As darkness fell, Cassidy was checking the northern sensor line when the voice came from 6 feet to her right, from a shadow that had been only shadow a moment before. Your perimeter is solid, Dex Calloway said. I still walked right through it. She had learned long ago not to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He stepped forward into the weak light of her headlamp. Lean quiet with the watchful stillness of a man who had spent his career being the thing other people did not notice until it was too late. He looked out at the dark mountain and read it the way other men read newspapers. You picked good ground, he said. High. One real approach, a couple of bad ones. Whoever taught you terrain selection taught you well. A pause. I think that was me. It was you, Cassidy said. Then I have only myself to blame for how difficult you're about to be. He fell into step beside her without being asked, the two of them moving along the sensor line together through the dark. He listened while she walked him through the perimeter, asked 2 precise questions, pointed out one gap she had not seen. His voice carried no judgment about the gap. He simply covered it in the same motion as pointing it out, pulling a sensor unit from his pack and setting it into the ground while they kept walking. You know what you're asking, he said eventually. You're not asking us to win a gunfight. You're asking us to go to war with a man who owns half the people who would be sent to investigate his crimes. I know, she said. That's exactly why I need more than rifles. I need witnesses. A record so clean and so complete that even Steck can't bury it. Will you stay? He was quiet for a moment. Then he kept walking. I was never going to leave, he said. I just needed to hear you ask. They were gathered in the cabin near 2 a.m, the 4 of them with maps spread across the table, when the sound of a vehicle came grinding up the logging trail. Wade's hand went to his sidearm. Dex was at the window before the sound had fully registered, gone completely still, reading the dark yard below. Expecting someone, Garrett asked. No, Cassidy said. She had the rifle off the table and was moving toward the door. The truck stopped at the bottom of the steps. Engine died. An old man climbed out slowly. He stood in the dark, and even before the porch light reached his face, Cassidy knew exactly who it was, and the rifle lowered in her hands, not from relief but from sheer disbelief. No, she said softly. No way in hell. Colonel Frank Rains stepped into the light. Grayer than she remembered, slower, but carrying himself with the same bearing she had known 15 years ago. His eyes found hers across the dark yard and held them, and there was something in his face she had never seen there before in all the years she had known him. Something that looked very much like shame. Cassidy walked to the top of her steps and looked down at the man who 15 years ago had stood in a room full of officers and said, with her in the room, that women had no business in special operations. You've got a lot of nerve, she said quietly, driving up my mountain in the middle of the night. I know. You said I'd get good soldiers killed. You said it to my face. I know what I said. His voice was rough. I've known it every day since. I watched your career, Holt. Watched you do things I told everyone couldn't be done, and every single time I heard my own voice in my head saying you couldn't. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. I came because Garrett called me, and because when he told me what was here, when he said the name Steck, I understood I had a choice. He met her eyes. I could keep being the man who was wrong about you 15 years ago, or I could finally be of some use. Cassidy held his gaze, and then something in her expression shifted, a small, careful change. Steck, she said. You said the name Steck like you know it personally. Rains was quiet for a moment. I've known that name for 20 years, he said. I knew what he was doing, and I knew where the evidence was buried, and I told myself it was above my level, above my clearance, above my ability to touch. He looked at the mountain, at the steel door somewhere in the dark beneath their feet. I was a coward, Holt. A man I respected told me once that there is a particular kind of cowardice that wears the uniform of caution. I never forgot it. I never did anything about it either. His jaw tightened. I've got federal contacts, trusted ones. People who've spent their careers waiting for evidence exactly like what's in that bunker. I'm too old to do much fighting. But I can open doors none of you can. And I came to offer that. That's all. The part of Cassidy that had carried his words like a wound for 15 years wanted to send him back down the mountain. That part was real, and she did not pretend it wasn't. But she had not survived 3 wars and 8 months alone on a mountain by letting old wounds make her decisions. Your contacts are clean, she said. Because if I let anyone near this archive who belongs to Steck, we're all dead, and so is everything we've built here. They're clean. I'd stake my life on it. You are staking your life on it, Cassidy said. All of ours. I understand that. She held his gaze one moment longer. Then she stepped aside from the doorway. Come inside, Colonel. We've got work to do. He climbed the steps and paused at the top, and for just a second, the old Marine let something honest show through. I was wrong about you, he said. About all of it. I've waited 15 years to say that to your face. I know you were, Cassidy said. Now get inside before you let the cold in. There was no anger in it. Rains heard that, and something in his shoulders eased as he stepped through the door. What followed was 3 days that did not stop. They worked the way people work when they have a deadline they cannot negotiate. Decks ranged out from the cabin each dawn and dusk in movements so quiet the others sometimes forgot he had gone, returning with information about positions, angles, places Steck's sweep team would look, and places they would not. Wade moved through the approaches with the focused joy of a man who had spent his career building things designed to be found, and was now building things designed never to be found until it was too late. Garrett staged medical supplies and marked fallback points with the quiet professionalism of someone who knows that preparation is the only medicine that works before the fact. Rains worked his satellite phone in long, careful calls, confirming chains of custody, confirming legal frameworks, confirming that the men on the other end of the line were exactly where he needed them to be. And Cassidy documented everything. Every sensor log, every thermal reading, every movement on this mountain over 8 months. She transferred it all to 3 separate locations, with Garrett double-checking every transfer because the case file mattered as much as the bodies, and she had not spent 8 months building it to lose it in the final hours. She was completing the last documentation run, moving fast through the lower perimeter in the dark of the 3rd evening when the radio on her belt cracked to life. It was one of Dex's deep sensors, the ones buried 2 miles out along the main approach. It tripped. Then a second one tripped behind it. Then a third. Cassidy was already moving back toward the cabin at a jog, keying her earpiece. Dex, talk to me. His voice came back flat and immediate. Multiple contacts, main approach, disciplined spacing, no lights coordinated movement. These are not Dodd's leftovers, Cassidy. How many? A pause while he counted. 14. Moving in elements. They've studied this approach. They know the terrain almost as well as we do. Almost, Cassidy said. She pushed through the cabin door, and the change in her face was all the communication anyone needed. The maps went to the floor, hands went to weapons. The easy talk that had existed 1 second before ceased to exist. Almost is the only word that matters tonight, she said. She looked at the 4 people in the room. Colonel, you're not in this fight. You're too valuable. Get on that phone the second the shooting starts. I want your contacts to know it started. I want timestamps. If we don't make it through tonight, I want a record of exactly who came up this mountain and exactly what they came to bury. Rains was already reaching for the satellite phone. Understood. Dex, you're my eyes. I want to know where every one of them is before they know where any of us are. Already moving, Dex said, and he was out the back before the words had finished. Wade, the approaches are yours. Wade picked up his bag with the expression of a man who has been waiting 3 days for this specific sentence. My favorite words, he said, and he was gone. Garrett. Fallback point in medical. Keep the case files safe. If it comes to it, that file leaves this mountain even if we don't. It'll leave, Garrett said. I promise you that. She chambered around and went out into the dark. The first shadow died without knowing the mountain had been watching him for an hour. Dex's voice in her earpiece was low and steady, the calm of a man reciting weather. Lead Element 4, men crossing the dry creek at the south approach. moving in pairs, professional spacing. Whoever trained these people was good. Second element holding 200 yards back. They're using the first 4 to find your defenses for them, Smart Cassidy murmured. She was already flat on the high ridge, cold granite familiar against her body, now the scope reading the darkness below. They're spending the first 4 to map us. Let them. The moment the lead man's boot comes down on the flat rock by the split pine, Dex said, "I need your call." Wade left something there. Copy. She tracked the lead man through the scope, a real operator, moving well-reading terrain, covering angles with the fluency of someone who had done this in places where mistakes were permanent. He came up the trail toward the split pine, and she stayed with him through the glass, and at the exact moment his boot came down on the flat granite, she said one word: "Now." The charge went off with a flat, hard crack that the mountain caught and redistributed in 4 directions at once, and the lead element ceased to exist as a coordinated unit in the space of a single second. Cassidy shifted immediately. The second man was running for the tree line, and she tracked him through the scope and fired once, and he did not reach it. Through the glass, she watched the survivors scatter and fire at shadows, and each other's muzzle flashes, their radio discipline gone, the mountain throwing their voices back at them from wrong directions. 2 down from the charge, Dex reported, his voice unchanged. 2 running. First element is broken. Third one's mine, Cassidy said, and she put her crosshairs on a man who had stopped behind a boulder to key his radio and fired once, and the man stopped keying his radio. 3 down. Second element has gone to ground. They know it's not random. Good. Watch the man who isn't moving. Everybody else is reacting. He's thinking. That's the one who's actually dangerous. She had seen it immediately. While the rest of the second element scrambled and repositioned, one man at the rear had gone perfectly still behind a fallen log, not panicking, not firing, studying the mountain the way she studied it, reading the angles, working backward from where the shots had originated. This was the man Steck had actually sent. "Dex," she said. "The still one at the base of the south face. That's their commander. He's reading us. He's going to work out my position in about 90 seconds. I see him." She was already moving, sliding back off the ridge, breaking down the hide in practiced silence, crawling 40 yards along a path she had cleared months ago for exactly this contingency. She settled into the second position with a completely different angle on the slope, and 20 seconds later, a shot cracked out of the dark below and struck the exact rock where her body had been. "He found your first position," Dex said. "I know." She watched the commander through the scope and felt something cold and focused and almost like respect. He had calculated correctly. He had made the right move. The only thing wrong with his calculation was that she had been counting on him making it. "Now he thinks he understands me," she said. "That's the most dangerous thing I can let him believe." Below, the commander went still again after the shot, processing the fact that he had calculated correctly and hit nothing. He keyed his radio. She read his lips. "The target is mobile. She has support. This is a prepared defense. Recalculate." But recalculating meant slowing down, and slowing down was exactly what she needed, because slow gave Wade time. "They're stacking at the base of the east draw." Wade's voice came through the channel. 6 men. They think it's the soft approach." He paused, and she could hear the particular quality of his silence. "It is the least soft approach on this entire mountain. I just made it look soft." "Let them commit," Cassidy said. "All the way in." She watched the second element flow toward the east, draw in disciplined pairs, certain they had found the seam in her defenses. They moved with the confidence of professionals who had identified a weakness and were now exploiting it. At the exact moment the last man cleared the entrance, Wade's voice said simply, "Good night," and the east draw came apart in a sequence timed with the precision of someone who understood that the second charge existed to catch the survivors of the first. 6 men became 4, then 2, then silence. "East element is finished," Dex reported. "Charlie, that's 8. 8 of 14, and we haven't taken a casualty. Don't say it's going well." Garrett cut in from the fallback point. "That is a law of the universe. The moment somebody says it's going well, it stops going well." He was right, which was why what happened next happened. Below, the commander had finished recalculating. She read it in the change of his posture before he ever keyed his radio, the way his head stopped moving across the terrain and fixed on a single point above the cabin. "She's not defending the mountain," he said into his radio, and she read the words off his lips with cold clarity. "She's protecting a point." Everything she's done has channeled us away from one specific location, the structure on the survey, all remaining elements. New objective. We push directly for the structure. She can't hold us off and defend it simultaneously. Cassidy heard Dex's sharp intake of breath through the earpiece. Charlie, he said, he's figured it out. 6 men and they're abandoning the approaches, driving straight for the bunker. For 1/2 second she felt it, the real fear, the kind she had not let herself feel in 8 months, the cold edge of a situation going past what she had planned for. Then she felt something else. She felt the trap close. "Wade," she said, and her voice was perfectly level. He took the bait. Silence on the channel. "Please tell me," Wade said slowly, "that what I think you mean is what you mean." The bunker approach. She was already moving, repositioning to the overwatch position above the corridor she had designed in the first month on this mountain. The one obvious path to the structure. The one I forgot to fortify. She moved fast through the dark, sure-footed on ground she could have crossed blind. I needed him to be smart enough to stop attacking where I was strong and drive straight for what he thought I couldn't defend. Because that corridor is the one piece of ground on this entire mountain I have total absolute control of. Below, the commander gathered his 6 survivors and led them confidently up the path he was certain he had found by outthinking her. He moved with momentum. He had looked at this mountain and found the single thing she could not defend and was now driving straight for it. He had not outthought her. He had done exactly what she had spent 8 months making him want to do. "Deck," she said, settling into the overwatch position scope on the corridor entrance. "Confirm all 6 are in. Lead pair at the midpoint. Middle pair entering. Last pair." A pause. "Last 2 are in. All 6 Cassidy. All 6 are in the corridor." She closed her eyes for 1/2 second. She thought of the realtor who told her this mountain had no history. She thought of Murch climbing her steps uninvited. She thought of Garrett's voice on the phone after 6 years of silence saying, "Where do you need me?" Then she opened her eyes. "Wade," she said. "Close it." What happened next was not a battle. It was the mountain doing what she had spent 8 months teaching it to do. The corridor had never been a path. It had been a machine built piece by piece through the first weeks of her time here, and Wade had spent 3 days making it perfect. The far end went first, sealing retreat. Then the flanks one after another in the sequence she had walked in her mind 100 times in the dark. Cassidy did her part of it from the overwatch with a steady hand. And when the dust settled and the echoes died against the ridge lines and the corridor went silent, she lowered the rifle and waited. "Confirm," she said. It took Dex a long time to answer. "All 6, he said finally. His voice had lost its professional flatness for the first time all night. 14 came up this mountain. I've never seen anything like this. Not in 20 years. The channel was quiet for a long moment. 5 people on a dark mountain alive, processing the fact of still being alive. Then Wade's voice, and for once it carried no performance. "That commander," he said, "he was the best I've seen in a long time. And you played him from the first minute. You let him think he was winning right up until you'd walked him exactly where you needed him." "That wasn't a gunfight, Cassidy. That was something else entirely." Cassidy came down off the mountain as the first gray light touched the eastern ridgeline stiff and empty, and the others met her at the cabin. For a moment the 5 of them stood in the yard and looked at each other alive, the impossible night behind them. Rain spoke first, his face carrying the look of a man who has just watched something he does not have a category for. "My contacts have it all," he said quietly. "Timestamps. The whole engagement logged in real time. There's a record now. We can trace the men. We can trace the money. The money leads exactly where you've been saying it leads." "To Steck," Cassidy said. But she was already shaking her head. The others felt it before she spoke, the small, fragile relief draining from the yard. "It won't be enough," she said. "It's a case against the men who came up this mountain. A case against operators and the money that hired them." She looked toward the bunker. "But it is not a case against Steck. A man like him has spent 30 years building layers between himself and the work. The money leads to a contractor, and the contractor leads to a shell, and the shell leads to a lawyer who takes the fall for a number with enough zeros, and Steck stands in front of cameras and says he is shocked, simply shocked, and he walks." The yard was silent. "Then what was tonight for?" Wade asked quietly. "Tonight proves they came," Cassidy said. "Tonight makes it impossible for Steck to pretend this isn't happening, but it does not make a case against him. The only thing that makes a case against Steck is Steck on this mountain giving orders, making threats, saying what he's done in front of evidence we control. She looked at Rains. He has to come here. He has to come here believing he's in control, believing he's cleaning up a mess. And we have to make him want to come so badly that his pride overrides every instinct 30 years built in him. Rains stared at her. You're talking about luring the most insulated man in the defense establishment onto the one piece of ground where you control everything. Yes. Men like that don't come to the mountain. They do, Cassidy said. Until something happens that they cannot stand to watch from a distance, until the embarrassment becomes bigger than the danger. She looked at the tired faces around her. Dodd failed. Then 14 professionals failed worse on a federal record he cannot bury. 14 of his best beaten by one woman he still cannot name. A man who has controlled every room he ever walked into, who has never once in his life lost and had to sit with it, is lying awake right now with one question he cannot put down. She looked at the mountain. Who is she? How did she do this? And the only way he ever truly knows is to come and see for himself. The sun climbed over the eastern ridges. 5 exhausted people stood in the growing light and understood that the hardest part was not behind them. The night on the mountain had been the easy part. Cassidy looked at the steel door's direction and then turned back to them. He'll come, she said. His pride won't let him do anything else. She walked toward this cabin and stopped at the door and looked back at the 4 people who had refused to let her face this alone. Get some sleep, she said. All of you. Because the shooting part is over. She went inside. And the part that actually matters hasn't even started yet. Warren Steck read the report 3 times. He sat alone in his office on the 41st floor. The city of marble and power spread out below the windows, and when he finished reading the 3rd time, he set the pages down and did not move for a long while. 14 men. The best operators his money could reach, vetted and equipped and briefed and sent up a mountain in the dark to remove 1 woman and recover 1 archive. Every single one of them gone. Not captured, not scattered, gone. And the woman was still there, still breathing, still sitting on top of 50 years of names that could end everything he had built. He had not lost in 30 years. Losing was something that happened to other people. To men who had not built the kind of layered, insulated machine he had assembled around himself over decades. Men who had not learned that the secret to surviving everything was to never personally touch anything. Let the contractors touch it. Let the shells touch it. Let the layers absorb the consequence, while the man at the center remained clean and distant and impossible to reach. He had built it well. And now, something on a mountain in Idaho was dismantling it from the bottom up. He pressed a button. His assistant's voice came through. He gave a name, not a company name, a personal name of the kind that lived in no directory, the kind that existed only in the memories of men who had worked at certain levels of certain institutions long enough to accumulate a particular kind of knowledge. An hour later, he had a file. Former Navy SEAL, sniper, decorated, retired quietly, bought land in Idaho and went up the mountain and stopped being findable. No digital footprint, no community ties. A name, Cassidy Holt. He wrote it down. He looked at it. He thought about 14 men who had not come back from a mountain where 1 woman lived alone, and he thought about the question that had been pulling at him since he read the first report. How? Not why. He understood why. What he could not set down was the mechanical question of how. How a single retired veteran had dismantled a coordinated assault by 14 trained operators on open terrain without losing one of her own. How she had known they were coming. How she had let them come, and where she had let them go, and what she had been waiting for them to find. It was not luck. Luck did not produce results that clean. He picked up the phone. 200 miles away on the mountain, Cassidy was on the porch running a final check on the perimeter sensors, moving along the railing with a pen light and a small toolkit, crouching at each junction point to verify the connections, standing and moving to the next. Her hands worked while her mind worked, which was the only way she had ever been able to think clearly. Garrett watched her from the doorway. You really think he calls, he said. A man like Steck, you think he personally picks up a telephone and calls the woman who just killed 14 of his people? I think his pride calls, Cassidy said, moving to the next sensor point without stopping. I don't think he'll be able to help it. She crouched, checked the connection, stood. Men like Steck don't fear death. They've insulated themselves from it so completely it stopped being real. What they fear is losing control of a situation. And right now there is a woman on a mountain he cannot explain, cannot beat, cannot stop thinking about. The only way he gets control of this back is to take it over personally. To come here and prove to himself that he's still the most dangerous man in the room. She finished the last junction on the north railing and straightened. And when he does, Rain said from the corner where he had been working his satellite phone in low, careful tones, he walks onto the one piece of ground in this country where he is not. That's the idea, Cassidy said. The phone in her jacket rang. She did not reach for it immediately. She stood with it ringing against her ribs and looked at Garrett, then at Rains. Then she pulled it out and let it ring 2 more times the way a tired woman with nowhere to be lets a phone ring before she answered. "Holt," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. A pause. Then a voice she had never heard, but had been building in her imagination for 8 months. Smooth and unhurried and entirely without warmth, the voice of a man who had learned somewhere in his 50s that the display of emotion was exclusively for people who needed things from other people, and he had not needed anything from anyone in a very long time. "Do you know who this is?" "I know exactly who this is, Mr. Steck." She began moving slowly along the porch as she talked, checking the outer eave sensors, her free hand working while her voice stayed level. "I've been waiting for your call." Another pause longer, and in that pause she felt the small recalibration of a man who had called expecting fear and received something else entirely. "You're a difficult woman to find," Steck said. "No, I'm not." She crouched at the final eave sensor, confirmed the feed stood. "You found me fine. You sent Earl Dodd, and when Dodd failed, you sent 14 men to finish what he couldn't. You found me very easily. The trouble is you keep sending people who can't do the job." She let it sit. "Maybe it's time to consider doing it yourself." The silence that followed was the silence of a man deciding whether to be amused or offended, and she waited it out while she walked back to the door and leaned against the frame with her arms crossed, facing the dark mountain. "You want me to come there," Steck said. "I want this to be over," Cassidy said. "I'm tired, Mr. Steck. I've been sitting on this mountain for 8 months, guarding a hole in the ground full of old paper, and I am tired of it. You want what's down there, I want my life back. So instead of sending more men up here to die, maybe you and I sit down and find a number that ends this." She paused. "Dodd was an errand boy. The men you sent the other night were errand boys. I don't negotiate with errand boys. I negotiate with the man who signs the checks." The silence that followed was the silence of a man hearing exactly what he wanted to hear. Every powerful man at his level believed in his deepest core that every transaction came down to a number, that every person had a price, that the difficult ones were simply people who had not yet been offered the right figure. "You'd sell it," Steck said. "I'd sell my silence. The evidence stays where it is. We both walk away knowing it's there and knowing I release every page of it the second anything happens to me. That's the insurance. You buy my silence and the policy comes with it." She let her voice harden 1 careful degree. "And after the other night, you know I have the means to make sure of it." "I'll consider it," he said. Don't consider it too long." Cassidy pushed off the doorframe and walked back to the railing, checking one last connection, hands never stopping. "I'm not a patient woman, and the longer this drags on, the more I start thinking a journalist might be a cleaner solution than a deal. You've got 48 hours. She hung up before he could answer. The porch was silent. Garrett put his head briefly in his hands. "You just hung up on Warren Steck." "Especially him," Cassidy said. She pocketed the phone and moved to the door. "A man like that has never once had someone hang up on him. It'll eat at him worse than anything I could have said." She paused at the threshold. "He'll come. His pride won't survive being dismissed by a woman on a mountain. He has to come and reestablish that he's the one in control. That's exactly the man I've been counting on him being from the very beginning." Now she said, "We get ready." The 48 hours that followed were the most precise work any of them had ever done. Not loud work, not dramatic work. The quiet, exacting work of people who understood that everything built in this window would either hold or it wouldn't, and that there was no fixing it once the convoy came up the road. Dex moved through the mountain in the hours before dawn, placing Rains's federal contacts into positions so deep in the natural terrain that Steck's 6-hour advance sweep would walk within feet of them and find nothing. He worked alone and in silence the way he had always worked best, reading each position before he placed a person in it, making small adjustments to how a body met the ground so that the silhouette disappeared completely into the contour of the slope. He had done this work his entire career. He had never done it with more care. Twice during the night, Steck's advance team passed close to positions Dex had just placed. Both times he was watching from higher ground as they swept through and found nothing and moved on. Both times he waited until they were clear, then continued. Wade spent the 48 hours differently, moving through every approach to the meeting site with the systematic attention of a man who had nothing left to blow up and was channeling that energy into geometry. He identified 3 angles from which Steck's men might attempt to change the terms of the conversation once it started, and he adjusted the sightlines on each one so that Raines's people would see any movement before Steck's people had completed it. He did this without charges, without devices, purely by repositioning what was already there in the terrain, which was in its own way more precise than anything he had ever built. Garrett moved through the fallback positions twice daily, checking supplies, verifying routes, making the small, quiet adjustments of a man who had learned that the difference between the version of events that ended well and the version that didn't was almost always a decision made before the fact. He said almost nothing during the 48 hours. He did not need to. The work said everything. Raines made calls. Long, careful calls in the language of men who had spent their careers saying important things in ways that could not be traced. And with each call, the framework tightened. The chain of custody solidified the legal architecture that would make what happened on this mountain not just a confrontation, but a documented federal proceeding grew one layer more resistant to everything 30 years of money and lawyers could do to it. And Cassidy built the recording apparatus. Not one device. 12. She moved along the porch in the dark with a pen light and a small drill, placing each unit by hand, testing each feed individually, confirming the triple redundancy of the transmission to 3 separate locations that would receive the audio the moment it activated. She crouched at each placement and worked with the same focused care she had brought to every technical problem in her career. The understanding that the gap between almost right and exactly right was the gap between everything working and everything not working. She tested the full system twice from end to end. She would have tested it a 3rd time, but the hours ran out. Sheriff Dale Murch arrived on the morning of the 2nd day, parking at the bottom of the steps the same way he had parked the first morning, climbing up to the porch with the unhurried gait of a man who has made a decision and is done revisiting it. Cassidy walked him through the meeting site while she explained the 2 of them moving together along the porch and down into the yard and back, her pointing at positions and angles while her hands worked at the last of the perimeter checks. Never stopping explanation and preparation occupying the same motion. "What I need from you is the law," she said, checking a junction on the lower railing. "Everything that's happened here so far is a tangle of self-defense and federal jurisdiction that lawyers will argue for years. It might put Steck's people away. It will never touch the man himself. But if Steck comes up this mountain and says what I believe he'll say, and a sworn county officer witnesses it and documents it clean, there is no fog. There's no argument." Murch walked beside her, watching the terrain the way he had watched it the first morning. "You really think a man like that talks?" he said. "He'll talk because he won't think of it as talking," Cassidy said, moving to the next position. "He'll think of it as explaining. Men like Steck don't confess to people they've beaten. They give speeches. They want you to understand exactly how far out of your depth you were. He's not coming up here to listen to my terms. He's coming up here to look the woman who cost him 14 men in the eye and make sure she understands what she's dealing with." She finished the final perimeter point and stood straight. "And the entire time he's doing it, every word is going to land in 3 places he can't reach." Murch took his hat off and looked at it in his hands and put it back on squared. Then he walked to the corner of the porch badge, visible hands loose, and took up his position as though he had always intended to stand exactly there, and he did not move from it again. The convoy came at noon. 3 black vehicles on the logging trail, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had swept the mountain for 6 hours that morning and found nothing worth adjusting for. Steck's advance team had been thorough. They had walked every approach, checked every ridgeline, searched every position a careful person would choose to hide in. They had found nothing because Dex had put nothing where a careful person would choose to hide and had put everything where a careful person would not think to look. Cassidy stood on the porch and watched the convoy come and kept her hands loose at her sides and her face neutral. She gave Steck exactly what he needed to see. A tired woman who had run out of options. The vehicle stopped. Doors opened. Men in dark clothes spread into the yard with the practiced efficiency of professionals, eyes moving, covering ground, reading angles. Wade was tracking every one of them from a position they had not found. Dex was counting from higher ground. Then Warren Steck stepped out of the center vehicle. He was smaller than she had imagined. They always were. The ones who did the most damage were never the size of the damage they did. He wore a suit that cost more than her truck and carried himself with the absolute ease of a man who had entered every room he had ever been in and owned it within 30 seconds. He looked up at her on the porch, and his expression was curious. The expression of a man encountering a problem he finds more interesting than threatening. "Miss Holt," he said. "Mr. Steck," she said. He scanned the mountain behind her with the practiced eye of a man confirming what he had already been told, his gaze moving over the tree line and the ridge line above it. He found Murch at the corner of the porch and held on him for a moment, calculating, and then he decided a county sheriff in uniform was not a complication worth adjusting for. It was the first mistake he made on this mountain. "May I?" he said, gesturing toward the steps. "Come ahead," Cassidy said. He climbed. 2 of his men followed. The rest held positions in the yard, disciplined, their eyes moving the way trained eyes move when they are covering ground rather than watching it. Steck settled into the chair she had placed at the far end of the porch, the one positioned for the best angles on 4 of the 12 recording devices, and arranged himself in it with the ease of a man who had decided to be comfortable. "Let's talk about a number," he said. "Before we do," Cassidy said, standing at the railing with her weight forward, "I want to understand what I'm being paid to stay quiet about. I've read some of what's in that bunker, but not all of it. 50 years is a lot of paper. So you tell me. What's down there that's worth 14 men? What did I almost expose?" Steck looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression very slightly. The particular pleasure of a man who has won and wants the person across from him to understand the full dimensions of the loss before the transaction closes. "You really don't know," he said. "I know enough to be dangerous," Cassidy said. "I want to know enough to understand what I'm holding." That installation, Steck said, was built in 1961, Cold War continuity site. When they decommissioned it in the 80s, someone made a decision to use it as a repository, a quiet place for records that certain people needed to exist but needed not to be findable. He leaned back slightly. Procurement records mostly. The kind of documentation that shows exactly where the money went versus where it was supposed to go and the gap between those two numbers. Do you have any idea how much moves through defense procurement in a single fiscal year? Hundreds of billions. Every dollar requires paper. That bunker is where the paper went that proved the accounting was a fiction. 50 years of it. The names of every man who skimmed a fortune off the top and made sure the evidence went somewhere no one would look. "And your name," Cassidy said quietly. "My name is throughout it," Steck said, and he said it with something that was not quite pride but lived in the same neighborhood. "My name, my mentor's name, his mentor's name. 3 generations. I inherited the responsibility for that archive, the way other men inherit property. It has been my obligation to keep it buried for 20 years, and I have kept it buried through considerably worse than one retired sniper who bought the wrong piece of land. The deaths," Cassidy said, "the equipment that was diverted, the men who died because the money that should have kept them alive went somewhere else. Those records are in there too." Something moved behind Steck's eyes. Not guilt. Something more like impatience, the impatience of a man asked to account for weather. "Casualties," he said, "are a cost of every enterprise at this scale." Cassidy heard those words land in 12 places at once. She had attended the funerals, shaken the hands of the families, said nothing because the people above her said it was handled. She had carried that knowledge like a stone in her chest for 8 years, the knowledge that handled meant buried, that the truth had been presented to the system, and the system had decided the truth was inconvenient. She looked at Warren Steck and felt something go very still and very cold inside her. She did not move. She had waited 8 months. She could wait 8 more minutes. "So the deal," she said. "I stay quiet about 3 generations of stolen money and the men who died to make it possible. And in exchange, you live and you become comfortable," Steck said. "I am a generous man to people who understand their position. Name a figure." We both know you're going to name one because the alternative is that I leave this mountain and you have an accident and that bunker has a fire and in 6 months no one remembers either of you existed. He leaned forward slightly. I came up here personally to make sure you understand that there is no version of this where you prevail. There is the version where you are paid and the version where you are erased. Those are the only two doors. The porch was very quiet. Cassidy looked at him for a long moment. And then she smiled. Not the smile of a beaten woman, the smile of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just set it down. There's a third door, she said. She turned her head toward the corner of the porch. Sheriff Murch, did you hear all of that? Every word Dale Murch said, and he stepped forward off the corner with his hand resting on his sidearm, and 26 years of law enforcement settled into his voice like ballast. Warren Steck, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder, and a list of additional charges my office is going to spend the next year writing down. You have the right to remain silent. Steck laughed. A real laugh, the first genuine thing he had produced since stepping out of the vehicle. His men's hands moved to their weapons, and the familiar ease flooded back into his face, along with something colder beneath it. You foolish old man, he said. A county sheriff and a washed-up veteran on a mountain. Your word against mine. Whatever recording you think you have is inadmissible, and my lawyers will have it suppressed before you finish filling out the paperwork. You will be dead before you finish reading my rights. Nobody heard but me, Murch agreed. His voice was mild. And the recording devices, Cassidy said. Steck went still. 12 of them, Cassidy said. Running since before you got out of the car. Everything you just said. Every word about the archive, about the procurement records, about the names, about the men who died, about payment or erasure, all of it went out live in real time the moment you opened your mouth. She looked at him steadily. It landed in 3 places at once. A federal task force that has been building toward this for the better part of a decade. A journalist who has been holding the outline of this story for 15 years, waiting for the one piece that makes it undeniable. And an automated archive that has already transmitted and that no power on this earth, including mine, can call back. She let it settle. You didn't come up here to take control of a situation. You came up here to confess on record to a federal proceeding. You've been doing it for the last 10 minutes. You just didn't know who the audience was. The blood left Warren Steck's face steadily the way water leaves something when the vessel tips. His lawyers were very good. His lawyers were the best 30 years of accumulated power could retain. And some fast, precise part of his mind was already running the calculation of what his lawyers could do with 12 devices and 3 simultaneous feeds and a county sheriff as primary witness and arriving at a number very close to nothing. You're bluffing, he said. His voice had changed. Not cracked. Changed. My people swept this mountain. There is no signal getting off this rock that I don't control. Your people swept for what your money taught them to look for, Cassidy said. They found everything a person with normal training would hide. She looked toward the tree line. They just didn't find my people. From the trees, from the position Steck's 6-hour sweep had passed within feet of and never located, Raines's federal contacts rose. Weapons leveled. 2 more appeared from behind the vehicles in the yard, stepping out of ground that had looked empty 3 seconds before. And from a position above the cabin that nobody had found, Wade Pruitt's voice came down across the yard, with the cheerfulness of a man who has been bored for 2 days and is genuinely happy to be finished waiting. I really wouldn't, fellas. I've been very patient and I am running out of it. Steck's men were professionals. They read the ground. They understood immediately and completely that they had walked into a position from which there was no exit involving weapons, and they raised their hands one by one without drama because professionals who read ground correctly do not die for a lost cause. Warren Steck sat in the chair on Cassidy Holt's porch and watched 30 years of insulation come apart around him in the space of 10 seconds. He looked at his hands. He looked at the yard full of federal agents that had not been there a minute ago. He looked at the mountain his people had certified as safe. I sweep every room, he said very quietly to no one in particular. I have swept every room for 30 years. It is not possible. You made the one mistake men like you always make eventually, Cassidy said. You couldn't stand not knowing. You couldn't stand losing to someone you couldn't explain. and your pride dragged you up a mountain to look me in the eye and feel like the most dangerous person in the room one more time. She crouched down in front of his chair so they were level, and her voice was very quiet. I've spent my whole career studying men like you, and the one thing I learned, the thing that finally let me catch one, is that you're all so certain you can't lose, that you'll walk straight into the only thing that actually beats you. She stood. You don't fear death. I knew that. So I didn't threaten your life, I threatened your control, and you came running up this mountain to take it back. She looked at Murch. The old sheriff stepped forward with his handcuffs, and in his face was 26 years of watching men like this walk out of rooms while better people absorb the consequence and the look of a man who will not watch it happen again. Warren Steck, he said, I do strongly suggest you use that right to remain silent. Rains came up the porch steps slowly. The old Marine looked at Steck being lifted from the chair, and then he looked at Cassidy, and on his face was something she had not expected. He came to attention, the full formal posture of a military salute, the kind that costs a man something when he gives it, and he held it. She returned it. Then she held out her hand, and he took it, and they shook once firmly like equals. That was all that needed to be said. The federal teams went into the bunker that afternoon. What they found in the sealed Cold War dark was worse than even Cassidy had fully known, because she had read extensively but not completely. And the final third of the archive was the part that would take people the longest to process. Names she recognized. Names the country recognized. 3 generations of it documented in the careful handwriting of men who had been absolutely certain it would never surface. The names started going out that night. The story broke the following morning, and by noon it was the only story anyone was talking about. And by the morning after that, it was the kind of story that changes the shape of things permanently, the kind that moves through a country the way a river moves through a plain, finding every low place, leaving the landscape different than it was before. Cassidy stood on her porch that evening, watching the last of the federal vehicles work down the logging trail, listening to the mountain go quiet behind them. The bunker was empty now, its 50 years of secrets carried out in evidence boxes to rooms where they would do the work the truth is supposed to do. She was still standing there watching the last dust settle on the trail below when Garrett came out and stood beside her and handed her a cup of coffee without a word. They stood in the quiet for a while. You built it, he said finally. 8 months alone up here. The case, the archive, the mountain itself. We just showed up at the end and held the corners. Cassidy said. That's the whole word right there. She turned the cup in her hands, watching the last light on the ridge line. I almost didn't call, she said. Even after the shooting started. Even after I knew the real ones were coming. I sat with that phone for 2 days because some part of me had decided it was better to die up here with the truth than to pick up a phone and ask any of you to stand in front of a bullet meant for me. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know when asking for help started feeling like failure. Somewhere between the career and the funerals and the coming home to a country that had moved on from everything that didn't move on from me, it did. She set the coffee down on the rail and pushed off it, moving toward the steps. It wasn't strength. Carrying it alone for 8 years wasn't strength. It was just being alone and calling it something noble so it wouldn't hurt as much. She went down the steps into the yard where the others were. Murch was leaning against his county truck with the posture of a man who has finally, after a very long time, gotten to be the part of the law that mattered. Raines was still on the satellite phone, still working, because the work of this kind of case does not end with an arrest. Wade was walking a final check of the approaches, unable to stop moving even now, and she understood that. Dex was somewhere in the tree line, which meant he was exactly where he needed to be. She walked out to meet them in the last of the Idaho light across the ground that powerful men had believed could bury the truth across the mountain, that had become instead the place the truth finally clawed its way back up into the light. The realtor had told her this mountain had no history. Empty range. Nobody ever lived here. That was why it was cheap. She crossed the yard to where her people were standing, moving through the fading light with the easy stride of someone who knows exactly where she is going. It had more history than the whole county, she thought. And now it has a new one. She had carried the weight alone for long enough. She would never have to carry it alone again.